Hello, peeps. It is Saturday, August 22nd, 2020. It's a beautiful day outside, 85-degree day here in Portland. And that's right, I'm sitting inside talking about records. That's how dedicated I am. Today I'm going to talk about Big Audio Dynamite. This is a band that I have a lot to say about. I have pretty much everything they've ever released. And I have a lot of passion about this band. There are a lot of 80s bands that are the obvious choices in terms of like favorite 80s bands, like The Cure and Depeche Mode and Susie and the Banshees and Devo and all kinds of other bands that are typically loved throughout the decade of the 80s. New Order. I love all these bands, but I feel like we know about these bands backwards and front. There's been 100 million documentaries about them, and we all know about them. That doesn't mean I won't talk about my personal connection to these bands at some point in the future. I do love those bands, all the ones I just mentioned, but there are some bands that sort of flew under the radar. They had some modicum of popularity in the 80s or whatever decade they came out of. And I'm going to try to focus on those bands as I do these videos. I'd like to try to focus on groups and artists that just maybe flew under the radar a little bit or have a extensive catalog that I don't see a lot of people talking about. And one of those bands is Big Audio Dynamite. I'll give you a brief background on them, or maybe not so brief. Mick Jones, basically, of The Clash, formed Big Audio Dynamite after he left The Clash. He left The Clash after Combat Rock was released. Combat Rock came out in 82. I think he and Strummer had decided to go their separate ways in 83 at some point. Maybe it was even early 84 that they separated. What caused that separation, too, mainly was Mick Jones's desire to expand their sound and their approach to music. They had experimented with some different sounds, especially on Sandinista. They experimented with hip hop and electro and gospel music and dub and reggae, and they'd done all that, and they threw it all into a big soup on Sandinista, which is a great album in its own right. And then they further explored that in a much more condensed form on Combat Rock, arguably their best album. I would argue that it is their best album. The Clash were one of those bands that I thought just kept getting better. If I were to rate their albums, I would start from Combat Rock at number 1 and then just go back. Cut the Crap doesn't count. That's not a Clash album. If you don't have Mick Jones on board, that's not a Clash album. And shame on Joe Strummer for even thinking that it was. And I think Strummer would agree with me. In later years, I think he regretted his choices he made with Mick Jones toward the end of the Clash days. At any rate, the Combat Rock was supposed to be called Rat Patrol at Fort Bragg. It was supposed to be this big sprawling double album of electronic influences and sampling, which was key. Mick Jones was obsessed with sampling, and he really wanted to start incorporating electronic vibes with the Clash. And that's kind of what the Clash were all about, really, musically at least. They were about trying different things and trying to expand their awareness, not just politically and with their love songs that they did do, but they also were all about experimentation and trying different things. Or so Mick Jones thought. Strummer fought against that a lot toward the end of the Clash days. And that's why they ended up splitting up. I think because Mick Jones wanted to focus on a more experimental album with Rat Patrol at Fort Bragg, which was meant to be this sprawling double album with these long songs, experimental in nature, Strummer fought against that and wanted to kind of go back to the Clash's roots and make straight ahead punk song, guitar, bass, drum sort of setup and approach. And Jones didn't want to do that anymore. And Strummer didn't appreciate it, and they split. But if you listen to Combat Rock, it definitely set a stage for what Mick Jones would later do. It has a lot of sampling on it. Definitely their most pop album they ever put out, but very experimental in nature. Songs like Inoculated City with some great sampling on it. Very cool song. Ghetto Defendant, There's some Red Angel Dragnet, some really good funky songs on that album, and it flowed. Sandinista didn't really flow. Sandinista is a great album, don't get me wrong, but it's a triple album of just all kinds of disparate ideas going on at once. And as good as it is, and as sprawling and experimental in nature as it doesn't quite work as an album. It's a collection of really excellent tracks, but to sit through that album in one sitting is a slog, man. I don't know that I've ever done it. I've listened to bits and pieces of the album a million times over the last 35 years or 30 years that I've heard it. It came out in 1980, but I was only a toddler in 1980, so I didn't hear it when it first came out. I listened to it several years later when I was old enough to get my head wrapped around it. But Sandinista is a hard album to get your head wrapped around, and I think that's what Strummer maybe was fighting against when they did Combat Rock. They'd done the triple album. I think Strummer wanted to go back and do a single album, which they ultimately did. Jones was thinking more big picture, wanted to put out another double album, and it just didn't work. They split up. And in later years, I think Strummer, I remember reading a few interviews with Strummer saying that he wished he hadn't done that. Strummer was being very limited and tunnel visioned with his view of where the Clash could go. Jones was definitely thinking next level, next step. So when they separated, Mick Jones formed Big Audio Dynamite. And to me personally, Big Audio Dynamite left a bigger impact on me than the Clash did. I know the majority of people would argue with that. I know a lot of people who love the Clash don't probably even like Big Audio Dynamite. I love both. I think Big Audio Dynamite was a bigger, better, grander statement. And I think it definitely proved that Mick Jones was the songsmith in the Clash. He was the one that wrote the music. He was behind all of those catchy tunes with the Clash. If you think of the Clash, I think most people usually think of Joe Strummer because he was the main vocalist. But I think people tend to forget that Mick Jones was responsible for the majority of the music, the songwriting, the structure, the melodies. That's Mick Jones. You know, when you think of some of the most popular Mick Jones songs, or the Clash songs, you think of Train in Vain, which is a Mick Jones song. You think of Should I Stay or Should I Go, a Mick Jones song. Okay, arguably Rock the Casbah, maybe their most popular song, is neither. That's a Topper Heathen song, actually. But when you think of their most jangly, poppy songs, they're all Mick Jones. Stay Free, a Mick Jones song. Very melodic, very melancholic, very memorable in the Clash catalog. A lot of those tracks are Mick Jones songs. Even the songs that Joe Strummer sang on, like Death and Glory, or Death or Glory, Magnificent Seven, you know, the music there is written by Jones. He's the main music writer. So I think he proved to be the real driving force in terms of music creativity when he formed Big Audio Dynamite. And again, Big Audio Dynamite means more to me personally than it does with the Clash. In fact, the Clash, you know, as I get older, I tend to lose it a little bit with the Clash. I lose their message. It becomes a little more disingenuous to me. It's not to say I don't like the Clash, I do. But when I was a kid, I think I appreciated the Clash because you have a lot of misplaced anger when you're a kid. You have this anger and you don't know where to place it. You don't know where to put it. You don't know where it's coming from. You don't understand yourself as a human being. And that's what the Clash is. I think they're a very important band for young people. But as I get older, I look at the Clash and yeah, I feel there's some disingenuous approaches there. This was a band that mainly were art school students. Joe Strummer was the son of a diplomat. So when you listen to the lyrics, especially on their early albums where they're these street fighting kids who are, you know, singing about white riots and stuff, it's sometimes you look at their background and you're like, really? Aren't you guys a bunch of art students? It's a little, I guess for me, it's inauthentic when your message about hate and living in poverty and politics and racism and all these things. You can have those ideas, obviously. It's important that we have them. But they sort of set this stage and this framework that they were these kids who came from the street when they weren't really. These were kids who were going to art school and had benefits and bonuses that a lot of people didn't have. Topper Heaton, I think, was the only one in that band who actually came from the streets, the drummer. The rest of them came from privilege, really, different levels of privilege. But anyway, as I get older, I listen to The Clash, and it's a little harder for me to accept them because I feel like lyrically, it's a little disingenuous to me. Bands like the Sex Pistols came from the streets. They have every right to be singing what they sang about because they literally had no future and they had to create their own future. That's what John Lydon did. He had to rise from literal poverty, living with bugs and contaminated water in a shack, to creating his own future. He had to. He had no fucking choice. He just had to do that. I'm not going to talk about the Sex Pistols here. We know enough about them. They only released one album to begin with. But I will talk about Public Image Limited at some point, maybe soon, since I'm doing some of the bands that moved me in the 80s. Anyway, at any rate, I feel like it's hard to listen to The Clash now. But what Big Audio Dynamite did is easier for me to listen to. I feel like Mick Jones was every bit the lyricist that Joe Strummer was. And again, I know that will be contested probably, but I think he's every bit the lyricist, and he proved it on some of these Big Audio Dynamite albums. Mick Jones had the sneer, the satire, the wit, the humor, and the focus that Strummer had. Strummer was a brilliant lyricist, don't get me wrong. The guy was a fucking poet. He was great. I love Joe Strummer. I think Mick Jones is every bit as good as a lyricist, and definitely a better music writer, songwriter than Strummer ever was. If you look at the collected output of what Strummer did compared to what Jones did post-Clash, there's no argument. Jones's body of work is infinitely better. That's not to say that I don't enjoy what Joe Strummer did after the Clash. I think Earthquake Weather is a good album. I think there's 14 tracks on that album, 4 or 5 of which are very strong. The other 9 or 10 tracks, they're okay. Rock Art in the X-Ray Style was Strummer's greatest solo album. By and large, Strummer never delivered a great solo album, in my opinion. Mick Jones, on the other hand, I would argue that every single Big Audio Dynamite album has immense charm on different levels, which I will talk about now. Mick Jones just meant a lot to me. And it started really with Big Audio Dynamite. I knew who the Clash were. I discovered Big Audio Dynamite in the mid-'80s, I want to say 1986. I was 13 years old. I knew who the Clash were because they were played on the radio, but I had no idea who Big Audio Dynamite was for a good year or two after they formed. I discovered Big Audio Dynamite through MTV. Those of you who lived through the 80s and were old enough to be watching MTV in the 80s, you might remember a show called 120 Minutes. It was on every Sunday night at midnight. And if you grow up it's not so small anymore, but if you grow up in a smallish, somewhat cut off city like Portland, Oregon, like I did in the 80s, your access to underground music was relatively limited. You could find some stuff at Tower Records, and there were record stores around town, but it was still fairly limited. For instance, if an import record came to town and sold in the record store, you missed it. There was no internet. You couldn't go and buy a copy on the internet. If something came in from England and they sold, you never saw them again. And so Big Audio Dynamite was sort of this intrigue for me. They didn't just have imports. Their albums were released here in the States, but a lot of their best mixes and stuff were only on these import records at the time. And so discovering them at the time was a much more intriguing concept for me. I first discovered Big Audio Dynamite on MTV, 120 Minutes. Used to record it every Sunday night because I couldn't stay up that late. I was a kid. But I did record it every Sunday night. And I remember my intro to Big Audio Dynamite was V13, a single from their second album. And I was very taken with the song. I thought the video was shit, and still do. It's a horrible video. But the song was great. excellent song. It hit me right away, and I did notice it was the guy from The Clash, and they mentioned it on MTV. This is Mick Jones from The Clash. So that's my memory of first, the gears turning that this was Mick Jones. All started there in 1986. That sounds about right. So from there became my, there I started the journey in buying and tracking down every Big Audio Dynamite thing I could have. And literally that went on for years. In fact, I just 4 or 5 years ago, I tracked down the last Big Audio Dynamite record that I had been trying to find for years. I just recently bought something in the last 5 years, and now my collection's complete. I think I've got pretty much everything from them, but they're a band that really moved me in the 80s, and they still do. And as I listen to their back catalog again, their music speaks to me far more than The Clash ever did. I'm not trying to compare the two. They're different bands. They're different genres. They're different approaches and different time periods. But in terms of what Mick Jones did, I think what he did with Big Audio Dynamite is much more effective than The Clash. Just my opinion, but there it is. Anyway, I'll start at the beginning. Their first single and album came out in 1985. This was, even though V13 was the first song I ever heard from them, this is the first record I actually ever bought from them. This is E equals MC squared. This is from the first album. This came out in 1985. Big Audio Dynamite also had Don Letts here. Some of you might know Don Letts. He grew up in the punk days. He's now a documentary filmmaker. He makes a lot of movies about the punk movement. In fact, he made, I'm trying to think, he and Julian Temple, who made The Filth and the Fury, the Sex Pistols documentary, he and Temple, I think, worked together to produce these punk documentaries. But he's made plenty of music documentaries about punk and also about electronic. One of the best documentaries I've ever seen on electronic music and house and the origins of house and techno was made by him, Don Letts. I think the name of that documentary is Searching for the Perfect Beat, or The Perfect Beat, something like that. It's the title comes from the African Bambaataa song, but it is a great documentary. If you can find that, check it out. And this is Greg Roberts, who would later become Dread Zone. He and Leo Williams here. And also Dan Donovan was part of Dread Zone. But Williams here and Greg Roberts would later form Dread Zone, which is another excellent electronic band from the 90s. They have an excellent album called 360 Degrees, Dread Zone. If you can find that, get it. It's really one of the best electronic albums of the 90s. At any rate, this is my intro into Big Audio Dynamite. It has a couple of remixes. It has one remix of E equals MC squared. And then on the B side, it has a remix of A Party, which is fantastic. A Party was on that first album, and the mix on here extends it. It's like a 10.5 minute weird echoed dub chamber mix. Really good stuff. Way ahead of its time. That's another thing about Big Audio Dynamite that I feel like I should mention. Their stuff has aged way, way better than I feel people give them credit for. Better than The Clash, in my opinion. They use electronics and samples, and sometimes it can sound dated, but in a lot of other ways, musically, they were way ahead of their time. That was a great single. This is the US edition of Medicine Show. This had a Rick Rubin remix on it. So Rick Rubin was involved with Big Audio Dynamite as well. He remixed a few other tracks that I'll get to, a few other Big Audio Dynamite tracks, but this is the US edition. This has a B-side on it called This is Big Audio Dynamite. I think that's the name of it. Yeah, This is Big Audio Dynamite. A couple of different remixes on here, one of which is Rick Rubin. Highly recommend that. This is what I'm talking about in terms of Mick Jones and his lyrics being amazing. This was, I think this might have been their first single, The Bottom Line. I could be wrong about that. This is the UK version, and it has the lyrics to both tracks on this 12-inch. Basically, this Bottom Line version, on the album, it was only 4.5 minutes. This is 8.5 minutes on this UK 12-inch. This is the full version, basically. It's not really a remix. It's just the full unedited version. Why this album, or why this version wasn't on the album, I don't know. It's got an entirely new set of lyrics toward the second half of the song. It's just a completely different track. The album version is just cut in half and doesn't do it any justice. This full version is amazing. Lyrically, some of Mick Jones's most pointed lyrics. Those of you who would argue that Jones wasn't the lyricist Strummer was, I ask you to listen to this song. This is a great, brilliant song. One of their best. The B-side is Bad, which was also on the album, and this has a remix on the B-side. Don Letts does a little bit of vocaling on that one. This is E = MC squared. This is the UK version. This is a double pack actually. It came packaged with the US remixes of the Bottom Line. These are done by Rick Rubin. It has the Bottom Line and then Bad again on the B-side, but Rick Rubin mixes. These Rick Rubin mixes are far inferior to the original UK versions. They're not bad, but they're nowhere near as good as those original UK versions. This is yet another UK edition of Medicine Show. This has an additional remix of E = MC squared that's only on this double pack. This is from the video of Medicine Show here. I think John Lyon popped up in the video. I don't see him in this photo, but at any rate, this is a US promo of E = MC squared. Yet another remix appears on here. And this is the US version of Bottom Line. Has the Rick Rubin mixes. Some more edited remixes of Medicine Show. They really promoted the shit out of this album, as you can tell. And this is the album. This is their first album that came out in 1985. This is the US edition of This Is Big Audio Dynamite. And you know, I wasn't old enough. I didn't buy this when it was new. This came out in 85. I was just too young to know what was going on. But I don't know how this was reviewed, but things that I've read since the year that this came out in the last 35 years, it seems like this was very well received at the time. And it's not hard to understand why. Like, again, like I mentioned with the Party 12-inch, there's a lot it sounds dated with this album, but there's a lot that sounds way ahead of its time. Nobody sounds like this band. Nobody. They have a complete unique approach in sound, even to this day. So hearing this back in 1985 must have been a bit of a revelation with all the sampling. Basically, Big Audio Dynamite was trying to bridge this gap between punk and pop and electronics. And that just didn't happen a lot then. Or at all, really. That's why this band is a pioneering band that was way ahead of their time. This is their first album. And it's good. In my opinion, it's dated more than any of their other albums. But that doesn't mean it's bad. You know, it's their oldest album. It makes sense that it would be dated more than anything else. And it does sound a little dated. But some of the songs on here are really phenomenal pieces of work. Sudden Impact, again, Medicine Show, Sony. Great stuff. This album came out with a bang, and I think it took everyone by surprise from what I've read. It just was a very original album. Nothing quite sounded like this at the time, and nothing sounds like this now. So that came out in 1985. After that, they came out, I don't know if this was the lead single. You know, in fact, it wasn't. This was not the lead single. I'll get to the lead single, but this was from their second album, Number 10 Upping Street. This came out in 1986. This is V13. This was actually my intro to this band. This 12-inch, this is a US 12-inch. It has a remix of V13 and then two mixes of Hollywood Boulevard. Hollywood Boulevard is a great song, one of their best. But this is, I listened to this record maybe more than any other record in my record collection. It's one of the first records I bought as a child. And I have hammered this record. I should probably buy another copy of this. This is beat to shit, but I've played very well played record. I was just, as a kid, when you hear something like this that's steeped in electronics and rock music, I'd never heard anything like this before at the time. So I have a lot of very fond memories of this record. And it's just excellent in terms of songwriting and production. They worked hard, and you could hear it on tracks like this. This is another single from that album. This is a UK only. This never came out in the States. This is Sight CMC. This had a video directed by Jim Jarmusch. Pretty cool video, too. This basically just has 4 mixes of Sight CMC. Sort of a down-tempo, very hip-hop influenced track. This came out in 1986. So Mick Jones wasn't afraid to explore his fascination with hip-hop here. And then you can check out Mick Jones trying to look all badass. It's, I don't know. It's funny to see a white British dude trying to look all fucking hard, holding up his belt buckle. I don't know. Sorry, Mick, I love you, but Mick Jones dressed like this. That's all you need to know. Anyway, this is a good song, though. Very intense lyrics. Everything about this song's intense, and it's a really good one. This was the lead-off single from their second album, Come On Every Beatbox. This has not dated well, in my opinion. This was the big single at the time. But yeah, this hasn't aged very well, in my opinion. This has 3 remixes of Come On Every Beatbox. It's not bad. It's just, yeah, not one of their standout tracks. But that was the lead-off single for this, Number 10 Upping Street. So I always call this album the best album The Clash never released, because Strummer and Jones ended up rekindling their friendship and partnership on this album. This entire album is written and co-produced with Joe Strummer, with the exception of one song. This is basically a Strummer Jones album. This is a Clash album. And it is great. This is my second favorite Big Audio Dynamite album. I'm leading up to my favorite. This is an excellent album. The same biting lyrics you would hear on a Clash record, but the music is electronic. It's steeped in punk, but it's delivered with electronics, and it's got the biting political lyrics. Great album. This is so good. Songs like Sambadrome, V13, Hollywood Boulevard. The whole album is amazing. This is a really phenomenal... In fact, the worst song on the album is Come On Every Beatbox, the lead single. The rest of the album, Beyond the Pale, Limbo the Law, great place to start if you're getting into this band. This is a really beautiful piece of work. I wanted to mention a detail about this too. This is the original US edition. This is the repress. They ended up reissuing this with an extra track, Bad Rock City. You see that? Track number 5. Bad Rock City is it's a remix of Come On Every Beatbox. As you'll see, it's not here. This is the initial pressing, and this is the one you want to get because this has the original versions of V13 and Hollywood Boulevard, both of which are infinitely better than the ones that got released on the reissue. When they released this album with Come On Every Beatbox as the lead single, and then they re-released it when V13 got released as the second single. And Sam Seaver did remixes for that. And they used those remixes on the reissue of the album. Why they did that, I don't know. They're not bad, but they took those original versions of those 2 tracks off and put the 2 versions that Sam Seaver did onto the reissue, along with Bad Rock City. And that was a bad move, in my opinion. The original versions of V13 and Hollywood Boulevard on this original press are the ones you want. This flows with the rest of the album much better. They both do. The other 2 kind of stand out. They don't flow. And also, Bad Rock City is a remix of Come On Every Beatbox. You've basically got 2 versions of Come On Every Beatbox on the same side. Sounds kind of weird. It's not a bad thing, but if you're going to buy a version of this, I would track down this original version without Bad Rock City. Because those original versions of V13 and Hollywood Boulevard make all the difference. But again, this is essentially a Clash record. in my opinion. It's Strummer and Jones, and it's excellent. One of my favorite albums of the 80s. Got to pick that up if you don't have it. You won't regret it. So after the second album, I think when I started becoming aware of Big Audio Dynamite, I started reading reviews, and especially in the British press, they started getting shit on pretty intensely. And when that third album was gestating and singles were coming out, I can remember people really shitting on that third album. People did not like it. I think they just thought that Mick Jones had sold out. I can remember reading some reviews like Mick Jones is the synth pop guy now. I felt that was really unfair then, and I still think it's unfair now. Mick Jones was way ahead of his time. He was with The Clash, and he was again with Big Audio Dynamite. I think listening to these albums now prove that he was ahead of his time to some degree. This is a promo release of something that came out with the third album. This is Leo Williams here doing a Love Sexy tribute. Those of you who know Prince will understand this cover. But this was a promo only. This Bad Overture was basically a medley of tracks from the third album. And then this 2000 Shoes is a remix of a track on the album as well. This is I think this got released before the album. This was used to promote their third album, which I'll get to here in a minute. This is skippable. I mean, the 2000 Shoes remix is pretty good. The Bad Overture is, it's okay. It's just a mashup, really, of all the tracks that popped up on that first album. It's not great, in my opinion, but it's worth having. This, you know what? I'm gonna go. I keep going out of order here. I'm gonna go in order. This was the lead-off single for the album. Sorry, this thing's shaking. This was the lead-off single for their third album. This is Other 99. This is the US edition. It has an extended edition of Other 99, but basically it's just the album version and then the instrumental version tacked on at the end. It's not really a remix. It says that it is, but it's not. The real reason to pick this up are the two B-sides. It's got a remix of Just Play Music by Greg Roberts, the drummer, the Dread Zone guy. And then it has a B-side called What Happened to Eddie. Great, great song. They didn't do anything bad. In fact, like Come On Every Beatbox before it, this is the weakest song on the third album, I think, Other 99. It doesn't flow with the rest of the album. It's an obvious single, but I think it's the weakest moment on the whole album. It brings the whole album down, in my opinion. It's not a bad song, but it's in comparison to everything else on the album, it's not great. This was the second single, Just Play Music. This has a remix and then a B-side called Much Worse. Much Worse is a fantastic song. Sung by Don Letts. Has a kind of a raga dub feel to it, but pop as well. Amalgamation of different vibes and fluids on that one. This is the other version of Just Play Music. It has different mixes, or a different remix on it. Different cover, different mix. And that's leading up to their third album here, Tighten Up Volume 88. As the title suggests, it came out in 1988. This is a great album. This got panned at the time. I can remember reading some really brutal reviews. This cover was painted by Paul Simonon, by the way, the bassist for The Clash. Really cool picture, too. Obviously, multi-talented. Not only a badass bass player, but a great artist. Again, a great album. Love this album. It really, I still listen to this on a regular basis. It just has a vibe that is unmatched. Great songwriting. Songs are getting shorter by now. With BAD up until this point, their songs would kind of always trail around the 5 or 6 minute mark. But here they started sort of, the songs started mixing all together like it was almost a mixtape. Rather than there being 8 tracks on an album, this bumped it up to 12. The songs were now 2 or 3 minutes long. Not all of them, but it was more of a flow. And they sort of cemented a vibe on this album that they would follow after this with their next couple of albums. Everything was sort of like it was put together like one big grand idea. That might have been influenced by Prince. I mean, that's what he did with Lovesexy. He intended Lovesexy to be one long flowing album as one track, and this kind of follows suit. It's sort of, it has that feel, and it really flows. There is some great songwriting on here. Hip, Neck, and Thigh. The title track, Tighten Up Volume 88, is great. One of the best songs they ever did. Champagne, Mr. Walker Said. There's some really, really classic songs on this. Highly recommend Tighten Up Volume 88. There's some really good stuff on here. Very underrated album. And it got panned at the time. To this day, it still throws me how that happened. But we're getting into the late 80s, 89. I think this is the lead-off single. This is Contact. This is a French promo of Contact. It has a couple of exclusive remixes that only popped up on this French promo. Very good song. The remixes here aren't so strong. They just sound like edits, like radio edits. They're really not that different from the original version. They don't deviate from the original version barely at all. This is, I think, maybe this was the lead single. Maybe it was. I think this might have been the lead single. I don't remember. This is James Brown. This is a US edition, promo only. I don't think it came out. Did it come out in the UK? I think it did. But this has a remix of James Brown, and also has an excellent B-side called If I Were John Carpenter, which again is it's like a medley of everything on their fourth album, which I'll get to here in a minute. But it's like a 7.5 minute dance track. This is where Big Audio Dynamite, this is when the rave scene was really kicking into high gear, and Big Audio Dynamite was adapting that approach. And the B-side actually is stronger than the A-side on this. If I Were John Carpenter is a great dance track. This is another example of the B-side being better than the A-side. This is Contact. This is the US version of Contact. The B-side, in Full Effect, is great. Just a 7.5 minute house tune. And it was mainly written by Greg Roberts again. It was becoming clear that Roberts had a lot of his own ideas. Mick Jones was the primary songwriter, but Roberts was showing off a lot of his talents that he would later take to Dread Zone. But the remixes of Contact are really good. They're very strong. They hold up well today. And In Full Effect is awesome. In Full Effect is kind of a remix of an album track on that fourth album. The song's called House Arrest. You listen to it, it sounds like a remix of that, basically. Great single, though. Really good mixes. And then the album is Megatop Phoenix. This came out in 1989. I loved this album at the time, and I still love it today. This is a beautiful album. This is my favorite Big Audio Dynamite album. This got fucking panned when it came out. I can remember people hating this record. The best review I remember reading of this at the time was in Rolling Stone. They gave it 3 out of 5. I mean, it's Rolling Stone. Who the fuck listens to them anyway? They've been out of touch for 40 years now. But at any rate, that was the kindest review I saw, was Rolling Stone, of all people. This is a great album. This has aged so well. It was great then, and it's great now. Listening to this now, you see how ahead of its time this album really is. A lot of people will say it's dated. It does sound a little dated. The samples sound dated. But the songwriting and production is fantastic. It flows like Tighten Up Volume 88 did. It's got that same flow to it. It's longer. There's more to sink your teeth into with this. But it sounds like a party album. The whole thing flows. It never stops. It's like a mixtape. And the songs are written with precision. Production is precise. Great lyrics. Don Letts gets involved. He sings on the opening song. You feel like it's a real band. The band is all chipping in on this. And they're all on top of their game. This is the greatest Big Audio Dynamite moment. And just to show off, just because I want to show this off, I saw Big Audio Dynamite back in 1992, I want to say, there was a tour with Big Audio Dynamite and Public Image Limited playing together. And I met Mick Jones, and he signed my insert here. He signed this for me. Isn't that nice of him? This is basically just a lyric insert that comes with the album. But yeah, I hung out with Mick Jones for a couple minutes. It was pretty exciting. We talked about the Orb. He had just released a single with an Orb remix, which I will get to here in a few minutes. But we talked about dance music and rave music, and specifically the Orb. It was really fun. I'll never forget it. Anyway, this is a great album. Check this out. If you're starting to get into Big Audio Dynamite, this is an excellent starting point. It hasn't aged a day, in my opinion. This came out in 1989. It still sounds just as fresh as it ever did. The electronics, the lyrics, the fun. It's a fun album. This is one of those albums you put on a sunny day. It just makes you feel better. Or you put on a cloudy day to make you feel better, feel good. It's just a feel-good album. Top to bottom, every song. It's got a little of everything. Dance, rock, ballads, humor, samples, beats. It's all here. This is a great amalgam of why Big Audio Dynamite was great, all packaged in one album. Can't recommend that highly enough. I'll pull this up quickly. This is the Flashback soundtrack. It's a pretty good movie. It's it's an 80s movie. It's aged like an 80s movie. It's got Kiefer Sutherland and Dennis Hopper in it, obviously, but this has the full version of Free. Big Audio Dynamite, this was actually the last song they did with that original lineup. It's called Free. And this is noteworthy because this has the full version on it. It's 8 minutes. Typically, you could only find the edited version, but it's on this soundtrack here. The edited version is here. This is the 12-inch for Free. It has a remix on it. Nowhere near as good as the album version. After he did this, they split up. Big Audio Dynamite split up. Mick Jones and Don Letts and the rest of the boys had some creative differences, I think. And they decided to go their separate ways, but Mick Jones didn't want to stop recording as Big Audio Dynamite. So he didn't do that. He kept the name Big Audio Dynamite, but he slapped a 2 on the end with a new lineup. So it was Mick Jones, but he picked out 3 other guys to come with him. The rest of the band, original band, all left, and Mick Jones was left to assemble another band, and that's what he did. One of the guys was from Sig Sig Sputnik, the drummer. The guitarist was Nick Hawkins. I think the bassist was Gary Stonage. What a name, right? Anyway, this is a live album, basically. It's a live album. It's got, it's got live versions of Hollywood Boulevard, Baby Don't Apologize, Free, Hollywood Boulevard, blah, 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 blah. This is a good album. It's not recorded well, but it's a good document of what they sounded like live at the time. They put on their live shows at this time in the late 80s, early 90s were like a rave. They had a DJ playing. Like when I saw them, they would play their song, and then each song they played was bridged together by a DJ playing dance tracks to give it this rave feel, like a party. It was fun. Anyway, with this new band, this was their lead-off single, Rush. This is a white label. This has a remix on it that was, at the time, was relegated to this promo only. It's a deep house track. Really good. Ahead of its time. I remember being really impressed with this at the time. I mean, I was only 18 or whatever when I bought it. But listening to this now, it's still good. It's aged well. This is the commercial release of Rush. This is the US edition. This has, wait, is this the, sorry, no, this isn't the US, this is the UK edition. This has got 4 remixes of Rush that were only on this UK edition. These are okay. These were remixed by Mark Picciotti. He was one of those session remixers back in the 80s and 90s that record labels would hire without the okay of the artist. When these record labels wanted to promote a single, they would have these these studio remixers that they'd call upon to remix a record without the band's knowledge and do these remixes. These are okay. They're just kind of cheesy dance mixes that have not aged well. This is the US edition, Rush Dance. This has got some great mixes on it. This club instrumental is basically the same version on that white label, except it's an instrumental. And again, just deep house and techno vibes on that. I think Mick Jones did that mix. He did. So Mick was bringing it. This also has City Lights on it. Phenomenal B-side. One of those songs when you listen to it was a cover version. I can't remember the name of the person who did it originally, but it's one of those songs that you wonder, how did that not make the album? Really excellent B-side. So this is Kool-Aid. This came out in the UK and Europe only. Never got a US release. This was European only. And this was the first album from Big Audio Dynamite too. This is his new lineup of dudes. And this is a great album. Aged really well. I don't think it was well received at the time, just like Megatop Phoenix. But this is a great album. Aged extremely well. And what's interesting about this, and I'll get to that when I get to the next album, is this album got released in the US as it was retitled, and so the songs were refigured, and it had some different tracks on it that this didn't have, and yet this song had some songs that the release coming after this did have, and everything was different. Versions were different, tracks were different. Some of the songs were the same, but much like wildly different mixes. But it started here in 1990 on Kool-Aid when it came out in Europe. I can remember I had to track this down like a motherfucker then. I could not get my hands on it. It's a limited edition, as you'll see here. And this thing was hard to find back then, man. It took me a lot of work to find that. This album, basically, though, Kool-Aid was released as the Globe in America. This is probably how Big Audio Dynamite is most well known in America, is the Globe. Again, this has some of the songs that are on Kool-Aid, but not all. And nearly every song that appears on Kool-Aid that appears here is in a different version. And then this album has a couple songs that are not on Kool-Aid, and Kool-Aid has a few songs that are not on the Globe. It's all different. But it's very interesting comparing the two. Both albums are very much worth listening to. And this leads me to a mix that I did that I want to talk about. I've started a SoundCloud account, and I'll link it. I'll send the website address in the comments on this video when I'm done here. But I basically took all my favorite versions of these two albums and I did a continuous mix of it. Some of the versions are just better than the other ones. The Globe is better in some respects, and Kool-Aid is better in other respects. And there are songs on Kool-Aid that aren't on the Globe that should be. And anyway, I did a continuous mix of these two albums that in my head was the perfect version of the album. I basically compiled the two and made what I think is a great compilation. The way the album should sound, according to me. At any rate, I'll include a link to my mix on SoundCloud. Hopefully you guys can check it out and tell me what you think. This is the other single that came out from the Globe. The original version of the Globe is tough to listen to, man. This is the one Big Audio Dynamite moment that I just have never been able to get behind. It is, quite frankly, a shit song. It's hard to listen to. The corny rap is mainly the reason I can't get through it. It's not a bad pop song, but it is so cheesy and corny. It was bad then and it's bad now. I never liked it. But what it did yield is an Orb mix by the Orb. The Orb took this cheese that's this piece of Limburger cheese and turned it into what the Orb always did. like this long ambient dance track, and they edited out all the corny rapping. They did something even more clever with the sample. This track samples "Should I Stay or Should I Go," Mick Jones's own song. But what the Orb do with it is even more creative and more witty than what Mick Jones did. The Orb took this song and was like, we can do something better, much better. And they did. They churned out a beautiful remix. One of my favorite Orb remixes, actually. Yeah. Get this for the Orb, not Big Audio Dynamite. It does have a few other remixes on it that aren't bad. Pretty much every version of the Globe is better than the album version, in my opinion. It's just that rap, man. Here we go. Yeah, brilliant. How'd you come up with that lyric? So, after Big Audio Dynamite 2, Mick decided to change up the band name again. I think it was the same lineup, but instead of Big Audio Dynamite 2, they went by Big Audio now. Now, this was getting into the era where Big Audio Dynamite lost me. This first album from Big Audio, it's not bad, but it definitely kind of marked an end to what Mick Jones was, brilliant at doing. The lyrics just kind of, I don't know, he started losing his edge. The music was getting sloppier. There was this feel that Mick was sort of losing touch on reality or something. It's not bad, but this was the lead-off single, Looking for a Song. He basically sings about writing a pop song. I think this was his protest to radio. Like, radio play always insisted that, or radios would insist that they play a record that was under a certain amount of time. It had certain time constraints. It had to be written a certain way to get radio play. I think Mick was just pissed off that his music was getting dismissed in the music press as well. And so this next album he did as Big Audio was sort of a fuck you to all the bad reviews and the expectations. And that's what this song is too. It's Looking for a Song. I think this was his protest song against how fascist radio stations could be. Songs had to be a certain length and a certain way to get played. And Mick had problems getting Big Audio Dynamite's music played. I do remember his albums getting panned at the time, and I think this was in response to that. And some of this first album is as well. This is Higher Power. There's some songs you can tell Mick is pissed off. This is a weird album. It's a strange one. This is, in terms of Mick Jones' album, this is Mick Jones albums. This is one of the albums that's hard to get into. It just doesn't flow. It's always come off like a collection of tracks. And some of the lyrics are just flat out bad. Some of the music's flat out bad. I think he was just trying to go all ravey on this one. It just doesn't really work. Things don't ever really add up right on this. There is one great song on here, Modern Stone Age Blues. That is a great song. I think that's produced by Arthur Baker. Yeah, Mick Jones produced all of this album except Modern Stone Age Blues. Modern Stone Age Blues has kind of a Clash vibe to it. It's rock. It's like the one rock song on here. Again, this isn't a bad album. I would recommend you listen to it. But it's a very muddled, unfocused album. It's a double album. There's a lot of music on here. Not bad, but definitely they're not their greatest moment. This is the record I was talking about earlier that I just purchased in the last 5 years. This is an Australian-only promo, a double pack of remixes. I searched high and low for this for years, and it finally popped up on Discogs about 5 years ago, and I jumped at it. Some Australian DJ was selling it, and I bought it. This is basically a compilation of remixes and B-sides. It's got a few remixes that are only on here. I've never seen anywhere else on vinyl. It's got a remix of Innocent Child, a remix of The Globe, stuff I've never seen anywhere else. It's on this Australian promo. It compiles basically everything from their first album up through The Globe. Or no, up through Higher Power. So it's a double album, and each side of vinyl has got like 25 plus minutes. So it's not a great pressing because so much music is compressed on there. But a lot of music and well worth having if you can track it down. It took me years to find this though. Literally over 20 years. I couldn't find it. I knew it existed, and finally 5 years ago I found it. So leading into the twilight years of Big Audio Dynamite, here is a 12-inch for I Turned Out a Punk. This is on their last album as Big Audio Dynamite. This is a good record. This has got some decent remixes, but the original version is very good. I Turned Out a Punk. It's electronic, but Mick is kind of going back to his roots. It's very steeped in punk music. It's punk electro. Got some remixes, and it's not bad. This is their last album that they officially released, at least. This is F-Punk. Mick's got a picture of himself in his Clash days there. This is another double album. And like Higher Power, this album doesn't quite work. It's got some great moments on it, like I Turned Out a Punk, Psycho Wing. But a lot of these are just kind of uninspired, bluesy, lazily produced tracks. I would still recommend listening to this, but not one of the greatest moments. I would make an argument that this is Big Audio Dynamite's weakest moment. Not to say it's bad. Their other albums are all great, but you could tell Mick Jones didn't have much left in the tank here. Again, not bad. I would recommend picking this up, but not the greatest swan song. It would have been nice to have another album after this. And he did have a new album after this, but his record label, Radioactive, at the time rejected it. It was called Entering a New Ride. And you can tell why they rejected it. You listen to it, it's not great, but it's no worse or better than any other shit that Radioactive was putting out then. I think they would have released this in 96 or 7, something like that, Entering a New Ride. It's not a bad album. I found a download of it. Mick Jones put it up for download years ago. He wanted his fans to hear it because it never got an official release. And it's not bad. It's got some decent songs on it. There's a song on it called Must Be the Music, I think. Must Be the Music. Great song. But yeah, the album was definitely unfocused. I don't know if it was even the final mix. I think Mick had intended to do some additional mixing on it and never got around to doing it. It's still worth downloading if you can find it. I can't remember where I downloaded it. I think I just downloaded it on the Big Audio Dynamite site at the time. I don't know if that site is around anymore. This is the one official release that got put out from that album. This is a white label promo of Sunday Best. This was meant to be the opening single from the album, but the album never came out. This song's not bad. It's got some decent remixes. So that's my Big Audio Dynamite collection. Again, this band means a lot to me as I look back on them and look back on the 80s. I return to Big Audio Dynamite a lot. Just the other day, I was taking my jog around the neighborhood trying to find a playlist to listen to before I got ready to exercise, and I put on Tighten Up Volume 88. They're just a band that I come back to a lot. And it's interesting to see, you know, Joe Strummer's been dead for 20 years, but it's interesting to note. I remember reading an interview with Joe Strummer at the time, and he basically was talking about how he was wrong at the time to make the choice to leave, or not leave the Clash, but ask Mick to leave because Mick had this other vision. I remember this great quote that Joe Strummer said during in the middle of the rave scene. He said, "I wish I could have been Andy Weatherall during the rave scene than being Joe Strummer during the punk scene." I thought that was a great quote. Weatherall responded by saying, "I wish I could have been Joe Strummer in the punk scene than Andy Weatherall in the rave scene." The grass is always greener, right? It's always greener. But I thought that was an interesting circle there. Like Strummer fought against progression, which is something he always was for. And then he came back around and admitted he was wrong. If you listen to Rock Art in the X-Ray Style too, that's an electronic album mainly. Strummer had he did an about face with that whole approach to synthesizers and drum machines and electronic music. He didn't want to do it at the time, and Mick did. Mick saw the future, and Strummer fought against that and later apologized and admitted that he was wrong to do that. So it's interesting Think about where the Clash would have ended up had they stayed together. Arguably, they might have ended up doing number 10 Upping Street. I mean, it is co-written by Strummer, one of the great albums of the 80s. So, yeah, it's fun to see how one of the most influential bands could have stuck around and become this other thing had Strummer had that vision that Jones had. Again, I'm not going off on Strummer at all. I loved the guy. He's another guy I met, and I have his autograph too. I had him autograph my copy of Rock Art in the X-Ray Style. I saw him play. Those of you who know Portland, Oregon, Joe Strummer played at Music Millennium for about 50 people and signed records afterwards. And he stood there for 3 hours. He signed every single thing that anybody wanted signed, including me. I had him sign my copy of Rock Art in the X-Ray Style. But what a gentleman, man. He was joking around with people, hanging out with people. He gave out free tickets to his show. The show had not sold out, if you can imagine that. Joe Strummer came to Portland and his show was not sold out, so he handed out tickets for free on his own dime. And I went to that show on Joe Strummer's dime. Sorry, I love telling this story, but Joe Strummer was a real fucking man. So I'm not at all going off on him as an artist. But in terms of Big Audio Dynamite and Mick Jones means a hell of a lot more to me than the Clash does. And these records illustrate why that is. So I hope you enjoyed this Big Audio Dynamite video. Again, I'm going to post a link to my SoundCloud account where you can watch my continuous mix of The Globe and Kool-Aid. Again, I took all the versions of those two albums and mixed them all together as one continuous flowing track. And I hope you enjoy it. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And go buy some Big Audio Dynamite albums. You deserve to treat yourself today. See you next time.